Denise Hubble. We're going to chat about the endocrine system. The endocrine system works in tandem with the nervous system to control the body. So we know that the endocrine system uses hormones as chemical messengers that travel around the body in order to try to control the body, and that the endocrine system works in tandem with the nervous system. The hormones that are released by the endocrine system have the roles that are listed here, things like reproduction, metabolism, maintaining homeostasis in our body. An example of maintaining homeostasis would be maintaining a normal blood calcium level. We're going to learn that a couple of hormones are involved with that process. So it probably is logical to you that we have specialized cells in our body, and they're part of the endocrine system, that release hormones. They're secreted into extracellular fluid and they get picked up by the bloodstream. The bloodstream is the transporter of hormones. Well, it does other jobs too, but it includes transporting hormones. It distributes them through the body, but they only work at specific target sites. So just because the hormone is transmitted by the blood throughout the body doesn't mean that it acts everywhere. It only has an effect at target cells or target sites. The term endocrinology talks about the study of hormones and the endocrine organs. So if we were to look at hormones underneath a microscope, we would see that they look differently. There are three main types. There's amino acid based types. One of the examples we talk about are proteins. And then there are steroid type of hormones, which are made up of cholesterol. And then there are prostaglandin type of hormones, which are made from a type of lipid. And they're a little bit different. They tend to just act locally, so they don't necessarily get carried by the bloodstream throughout the body. They just have a local impact. Also, the target cells where these hormones work, they have specialized protein receptors that are able to recognize the hormone, and they will change their activity based on being exposed to a hormone. So when the hormone floats around the body in the bloodstream and finally reaches a target cell, what does it actually do at the target cell? Well, this list is an example of what it might do at the target cell. I won't read them all out, but one thing it can do is change the permeability of the cell membrane so that either things flow in or out of the cell, or that it may cause the cell to have more cell division or less cell division, for example. It may cause a cell to secrete something, as an example. So when a hormone reaches a cell, there are two different ways that hormones work: direct gene activation or second messenger system. Okay, so the direct gene activation method is used by the steroid hormones and thyroid hormones, and we're going to learn how that one works in a moment. And the second messenger system is used by proteins and peptide hormones. With direct gene activation, what happens is the hormone actually goes right through the cell membrane into a cell, and then that hormone actually goes right into the nucleus of the cell, and it causes new proteins to be synthesized. This is an excellent image showing direct gene activation. We see a steroid hormone coming along, going right through the cell membrane into the cell, and then right into the nucleus. And in the nucleus, an event occurs which causes a new protein to be produced. Okay, so in second messenger system, this is a different way that hormones can act. So what happens is the hormone goes to a target cell. On the target cell membrane, it binds to a receptor. This action causes an enzyme to be released inside the cell, and that enzyme creates a reaction which results in cyclic AMP being produced. Now the cyclic AMP causes some sort of response in the cell. So we can see that this is more of a domino effect. This is an excellent image of the second messenger system. We see the hormone come along, it's the first messenger, and it fits into a receptor protein on the cell membrane. This action causes an enzyme to be released, and that enzyme causes cyclic AMP to be released inside the cell, and that causes an activity of some sort for the cell. For example, perhaps glycogen breakdown, things like that. So some sort of cellular response. How are all of these hormones controlled? So what determines when a hormone is released or not released? Well, it's mostly based on negative feedback system. So if a hormone is low in the body, then the endocrine system will tend to release more of that hormone. And once the hormone reaches an appropriate level, then no more of the hormone is released typically. So there are 3 types of things that can affect hormone release that we're going to be studying here: hormonal, humoral, and neural. This is, I think of this also as a domino effect. The idea here is that one endocrine organ can release a hormone that tells another endocrine organ to release its hormone. Do you see what I'm saying? So this is the most common way that hormones are actually released, is that one endocrine organ basically tells another endocrine organ, hey, you should release your stuff now. So that's the most common way. A good example is the hypothalamus stimulating the anterior pituitary to secrete its hormones. Okay, so the way that the hypothalamus does that is by releasing hormone. And that hormone tells the anterior pituitary, hey, you should release your hormones. And here's an even more complex example of that type of stimulus. Such a great example. The hypothalamus can release a hormone that tells the anterior pituitary to release a hormone that tells something like the thyroid gland to release a hormone, or the adrenal cortex, or the gonads. So we see this sort of domino effect of one endocrine gland telling another endocrine gland what to do. Humoral stimulus of hormone release is the idea that blood levels of certain ions or nutrients can cause hormones to be stimulated to be released. The really, really great examples are the parathyroid hormones and calcitonin. These 2 hormones are produced in response to high or low blood calcium levels. We're going to be looking at that more in a few moments, but this is an example of humoral stimulus for hormone release. The parathyroid glands sit on the back of your thyroid gland. They're 4 little spots of tissue, basically, that are capable of releasing parathyroid hormone. I like the name of that. It's easy to remember. So I bring this up because these glands are a really good example of humoral stimulus of hormone release. What happens is, if your blood calcium levels drop, the parathyroid hormones are able to recognize that, and they release something, like we said, called parathyroid hormones in response to that. And we'll see that the parathyroid hormone stimulates osteoclasts in the bone to break down some of the bone tissue and release calcium. So you can probably appreciate how that would correct the low calcium level. Also, hormone release can be controlled by the nervous system. We've probably all had this happen when we were in a really scary situation. Maybe you had to make a speech for the first time and you got really, really nervous. What's happening in that situation is that nerve fibers are stimulating the release of hormones. And specifically, nerve fibers are going to the adrenal medulla and telling the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, and causing some of those symptoms you might feel if you had to make a speech and you were nervous. Things like a racing heart rate and sweating. This image shows the neural stimulus for hormone release, the one we just talked about, that we can have a sympathetic nerve fiber leaving the central nervous system and going down to the adrenal medulla, which is the middle of the adrenal gland. And that makes the adrenal medulla produce epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those are hormones that get picked up by the bloodstream and carried around the body. It's really interesting that the endocrine system is laid out a little different than the other body systems. It's sort of random glands spread throughout the body, and we're learning about them here on this slide. We're going to learn about what each of these glands do. So we've got the pineal gland, the hypothalamus is labeled there. Pituitary gland is below the hypothalamus, and it has an anterior and a posterior part. The thyroid gland is there, and Behind or posterior to the thyroid gland are the parathyroid glands. There are usually about 4 of those on the posterior of the thyroid gland. The thymus gland, the adrenal glands sit atop of the kidneys, and the pancreas and the ovaries in women and the testes in men. Endocrine glands are glands that don't have ducts. So that means that they don't have an opening where they release their hormones through. They simply create hormones and they drift away from the organ and get picked up by the bloodstream. So that's what this slide starts to talk about. Some glands are purely endocrine glands, and they're listed there. They are ductless. They have no little duct or little opening that empties into any specific place. They just simply produce hormones and let them ooze out of themselves. Hormones are released directly into blood or lymph, so they kind of ooze out and get picked up in the blood or the lymph. And some glands are a little bit quirky because they are a mixture of endocrine and exocrine. The best example is the pancreas. The pancreas is an amazing organ, and it has endocrine function, meaning that the cells just simply release some hormones and the bloodstream picks them up. But it also has exocrine glands or exocrine function, because some things that are produced by the pancreas are released through ducts into the small intestine. And so that's an exocrine function. So the pancreas is really interesting that way. The pituitary gland and the hypothalamus work very closely together. The pituitary gland is very small, about the size of a pea, and it actually hangs from the hypothalamus. And there's a great deal of communication from the hypothalamus down to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland has 2 parts, the anterior and the posterior. The anterior has glandular tissue that is very good at producing hormones. The posterior pituitary doesn't actually produce any of its own hormones. A lot of people call the pituitary gland the master endocrine gland because it tells so many other glands what to do. I kind of personally think of the pituitary gland as middle management. Perhaps some of you have worked in a supervisory role at your workplace. If you have, you've had a boss above you and you have employees sort of below you. That makes you middle management. The pituitary gland is a lot like that because the hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland what to do, and then the pituitary gland tells a lot of other glands what they should do. So the pituitary gland is kind of in the middle of that hierarchy. Now the hypothalamus to me is the ultimate boss, and we'll see why here in a moment. It produces hormones and it produces releasing hormones or stimulating hormones and inhibiting hormones. The stimulating hormones are just like what they sound like. They tell another gland that they should be releasing a hormone. The inhibiting hormones that the hypothalamus releases tells another gland it shouldn't be releasing hormones. Kind of like a yes or no messenger. These hormones are released into what we call portal circulation. And this portal circulation is a little circulation system from the hypothalamus down to the anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus also actually makes 2 hormones called oxytocin. I'm excited to talk about that one with you guys. And ADH. I'm excited to talk about that as well. It's really interesting. These 2 hormones that the hypothalamus produces are carried down to the posterior pituitary and stored down there. This is such a great picture. What we see near the top is the hypothalamus. Below that, we have 2 parts of the pituitary gland. We're going to focus on the posterior pituitary here. What we're learning here is that the hypothalamus actually produces ADH and oxytocin, so antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. And it shuttles that hormone down to the posterior pituitary where it gets stored. Then it can be released by the posterior pituitary into the bloodstream, and it has an impact further on in the body. For example, the antidiuretic hormone goes to the kidney tubules, and it tells the kidney tubules to retain fluid and produce less urine. Also, the oxytocin, if it is released, it goes to the mammary glands and impacts milk, and it goes to the uterus and causes contraction of the uterus. Also, I want to mention that the control of when these things are released is under the hypothalamus's control. This really reiterates what we've already talked about, that the posterior pituitary is simply a storage house for oxytocin and ADH. Oxytocin is actually a pretty complex hormone. It's believed to be involved with falling in love and the pairing up of individuals together. Some of the other roles are that it stimulates the contraction of the uterus during labor and other times as well. It also causes letdown of breast milk so that an infant can receive the breast milk from a mom. Let's really take some time to talk about ADH, antidiuretic hormone, because this will come up over and over again. So antidiuretic hormone, as it says, it inhibits urine production. Urine production is called diuresis, so antidiuretic goes against that, doesn't it? So we're inhibiting urine production. We're going to have less urine. It does this by promoting water reabsorption by the kidney tubules. So we know we're going to have less urine, so we are going to retain fluid. You know, if we're not secreting as much urine, we're going to keep more fluid. That will increase our blood volume and our blood pressure. If you have really, really high levels of ADH in your body, it also causes vasoconstriction, specifically of your arterioles, and this also increases blood pressure. We also call ADH vasopressin, which is a great name because we know that it can act as a vasoconstrictor in high enough levels. So vasopressin is the term that we sometimes call ADH. If you go out and have a few drinks that have alcohol in them, it's not long after you have a drink that you have to get up and go use the washroom, because alcohol causes the inhibition of the ADH secretion. We know that this is two negatives then, because we have inhibition of antidiuretics. So we've got two negatives there, they cancel each other out. So alcohol ends up having a diuretic effect, which makes you have more urine production. The anterior pituitary is a very busy endocrine gland. Remember, this gland acts kind of like middle management. It has a lot of work to do. It is going to tell a lot of other endocrine glands what to do and what not to do. So here are some of the hormones released by the anterior pituitary. They're listed here. I'll pronounce some of them just because they are a little long. So follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, thyrotropic hormones, and adrenocorticotropic hormones. Those who like images, this is a very powerful way of studying. We see at the top we have the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus can releasing hormones or stimulating hormones into the circulation that goes down to the anterior pituitary. And this can tell the anterior pituitary that that gland should start releasing certain hormones. So if it releases growth hormone, that's going to affect bones and muscles and cause them to grow more. If the anterior pituitary releases prolactin, that is going to cause mammary glands to produce milk. That doesn't have to do with the letdown portion of releasing the milk. It's just about the milk production. If the anterior pituitary releases follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormones, those go to the testes in men and the ovaries in women. When the anterior pituitary releases thyrotropic hormone, it goes to the thyroid gland and tells the thyroid gland what to do. And if it releases adrenocorticotropic hormone, it goes to the adrenal cortex and tells the adrenal cortex that it should release some hormones. So just to review again about the anterior pituitary and the hormones that it releases. We have already talked about some of these things and it's laid out here quite well. This slide talks about the growth hormone and the impact it has and how it works, and prolactin and how that works. We've talked about these two as well, the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormones. They are called gonadotropic hormones because they have an impact on the gonads. Follicle stimulating hormone would be in The case of women, it stimulates follicle development in the ovaries. This is going to have to do with the egg being produced. And in men, it stimulates sperm production. Luteinizing hormone is involved with the ovulation of the egg in females, so the actual release of the egg. And in men, it has to do with testosterone production. So we can kind of understand that these gonadotropic hormones have to do with the reproductive system. The thyrotropic hormone is actually more commonly called thyroid stimulating hormone. I like the name because it's exactly what it does. The adrenocorticotropic hormone actually regulates the adrenal cortex. It tells the adrenal cortex what it should be doing. For anyone that's going to become a shift worker, you're really going to be messing with your pineal gland, because your pineal gland is responsible for releasing melatonin, and you may know that melatonin has to do with your sleep-wake cycle, that in the evening you typically produce more melatonin, and that assists you with a really nice good night's sleep. But melatonin is actually kind of a complex thing. I mean, indeed we know about it affecting sleep-wake cycle, but also it has to do with fertility and when our reproductive system starts to mature. The location of the pineal gland is in the third ventricle of the brain. The thyroid gland is just inferior to the larynx. It kind of wraps around the larynx. It's just at the, I should say, the base of the larynx. It produces some hormones, the thyroid hormones, and calcitonin. I think we know that thyroid hormone has a lot to do with our activity level, our metabolism. So if we have hyperthyroidism, we tend to have lots of energy. And if we have hypothyroidism, that's low, isn't it? Hypo is low. We tend to feel very tired and just want to have a big nap. So thyroid hormone is very closely linked to your metabolism. And it also has to do with our growth and development. And it contains two iodine-containing hormones, T3 and T4. We don't need to memorize the full names of those. Inside the thyroid gland, there are some special cells called the parafollicular cells. And what they are able to do is produce calcitonin. Calcitonin is released when blood calcium levels are too high. So when we have too high of blood calcium levels, we're going to have calcitonin released, and this causes calcium to be deposited onto the bone, so we can store this excess calcium. Let's store it away in our bones for now because we don't need so much. I've already started to talk about parathyroid hormone, which actually does the opposite, so they're considered antagonistic. The parathyroid glands, I like the name, they're right beside the thyroid. In fact, there are usually four little glands that are posterior to the thyroid gland, and they release parathyroid hormone. Easy to remember. Parathyroid hormone is released when your calcium is too low. So if your calcium is too low, what we want is parathyroid hormone to tell osteoclasts to break down bone and release calcium. And this also stimulates the kidneys and intestine to absorb additional calcium. These three mechanisms should help boost our calcium levels back up in our blood. This is such a nice way of looking at the relationship between calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. So let's start on the left, where we're saying that the blood calcium levels are too high. Well, the thyroid gland will recognize this and release calcitonin. Calcitonin will cause the depositing of calcium onto bone. So this is a way that we can store that excess calcium. Now, what if on the right we see that the calcium levels are too low? So what happens then? Well, we have these parathyroid glands which will release parathyroid hormone, and that will cause the osteoclasts to break down a little bit of bone tissue and release some calcium because we need it now. So we can sort of see how homeostasis is maintained by the balance of these two hormones. We really want to have a steady amount of calcium in our blood, and it's achieved by using these two hormones. Those hormones are antagonists because they do the opposite of one another. The thymus gland is posterior to the sternum, and it is responsible for releasing thymosin, and it's involved with the maturing of T cells, which is a type of white blood cell, and it's involved with the immune system that way. These adrenal glands are something else. There's a lot going on with the adrenal glands. So there are two of them. They sit on top of the kidneys, and they have two portions. They have the adrenal cortex, which is the outer portion, and the adrenal medulla, which is the inner portion. These two portions act completely differently from one another. So it's very interesting. The adrenal cortex acts like its own sort of endocrine gland almost on its own. It has 3 layers within it, and each of those layers secrete different hormones. For example, as it says, the outermost layer of the adrenal cortex secretes mineralocorticoids, and the middle layer of the adrenal cortex secretes glucocorticoids, and the innermost layer of the adrenal cortex secretes sex hormones. Now, when we get into the very middle of the adrenal medulla, it's different. It's called the adrenal medulla. It responds to nervous impulses. So let's look at the adrenal gland again to try to solidify our understanding here. What we've done here is cut a little section of the adrenal gland and then look closely at what it's made up of. Well, we said that there's an outer layer called an adrenal cortex and an inner area called adrenal medulla, the middle. So let's look at the adrenal cortex. Well, the outermost layer releases mineralocorticoids. The middle layer, or I should say second layer, I guess, of the adrenal cortex releases glucocorticoids. And the third layer of the adrenal cortex releases sex hormones. So we said that that outer layer of the adrenal cortex releases mineralocorticoids. The main type is aldosterone. Aldosterone is amazing. It targets the kidney and it causes an effect on sodium and potassium and water. So whether we're going to release it or whether we're going to keep it. So basically what aldosterone does, it makes you retain sodium and water and release potassium ions into the urine. The way that the adrenal gland knows whether to release aldosterone or not is affected by many things. Humoral factors are if there are high sodium or low potassium levels in the blood, this would cause the release of aldosterone. Or if ACTH has been released by the anterior pituitary, that would stimulate the adrenal gland to release aldosterone. Or if there's activation of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway, then that's a way that aldosterone production is increased. And this happens when a patient's blood pressure drops. That is discussed more in the renal system lecture as well. It's an important pathway. So again, it's called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway. And that causes increased release of aldosterone. Also, just as an aside, you can see that this is very complex, but aldosterone is inhibited if ANP has been released by the heart. So if ANP is released, we're going to have less aldosterone released. ANP is released when blood pressure is too high. There's a lot of data on this slide. I would encourage you to take some time looking at it and make yourself your own notes, ideally, related to this slide. You might also want to print it off quite large. Starting the top left, we've already said that if sodium is low or potassium is high, that is going to cause the adrenal gland to release aldosterone. Next, if there's decreased blood volume or decreased blood pressure, the kidney is able to sense this. And also, if the sodium's low and the potassium's high, the kidney is able to sense that as well. Then what happens is the kidney will release renin, and then the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway will be in effect, and the result is that the adrenal gland is releasing more aldosterone. Now at the top right, if we have stress, the hypothalamus will release corticotropin releasing hormone, which tells the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, which tells the adrenal gland to release aldosterone. Wow, that's a mouthful. But we see there's a domino effect. One endocrine gland is telling another endocrine gland to do something, which is telling another endocrine gland. What about ANP? Atrial natriuretic peptide, It is released when blood pressure is high. It's released by the heart itself. And what this does is actually inhibits the release of aldosterone. So it slows the release of aldosterone. So once the adrenal glands have released aldosterone, what do? Well, it's shown at the bottom of the slide. It goes to the kidney tubules, and it tells the kidney tubules to increase the reabsorption of sodium and water and increase the secretion of potassium. The end result, we're going to have increased blood volume, increased blood pressure, and we will have less urine output. So we're still talking about the adrenal gland. Now we're talking about the middle layer of the adrenal cortex. So it's the middle layer of the outer section of the adrenal gland. So what does it release? It releases cortisone and cortisol, which are glucocorticoids, and they are important in resisting long-term stress. They cause your body to increase blood glucose levels, called hyperglycemia. Also is anti-inflammatory, and it will be released when it's told to do so by ACTH. Talking about the adrenal gland, specifically the adrenal cortex, which is the outer portion of the adrenal gland. But now let's talk about the innermost layer of that outer portion. Can get a little confusing. Anyway, this area releases sex hormones, and small amounts are released throughout our lives, and they include things like androgens, which tend to be more male sex hormones, and estrogens, which are female sex hormones. Last but not least, we're still talking about the adrenal gland, but now we're talking about the adrenal medulla. This is the middle. Maybe that will help you remember, medulla, middle. So the very middle of the adrenal gland has sort of a separate role. It acts a little bit differently. It also produces hormones, and they're called catecholamines. They're epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine. In clinical, we often shorten that and call them epi and norepi. These are very important to know about, because sometimes in ICU patients, a patient will be given a drug continuously dripping into their vein. It's called IV infusion, and it might be epi or norepi. So we may actually administer these drugs to patients. So anyway, the adrenal medulla is capable of releasing these itself, and these are involved with the sympathetic nervous system. It's known as the fight or flight sort of mechanism. And what I mean by that is that if you were in danger, like if you're being mugged, for example, and you need to be able to run away or protect yourself and fight, what would you need to have happen in your body? Well, you'd have to have increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased blood glucose so your muscles can work well, and dilate your airways so that you can breathe really quickly. So, and these are some of the responses of having epinephrine released and norepinephrine released into the bloodstream. This image takes in a great deal of information, but let's break it down and make it easy. We're talking about short-term stress and long-term stress, and as a student, you're probably dealing with both of those. So I really want to acknowledge that. On the left, when we look at short-term stress, what happens? Well, the hypothalamus actually responds by telling the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, and we just talked about what the effects of those are. They're called catecholamines, and they do things like increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased blood glucose levels, and dilate the airways. So now let's take a look at long-term stress. Now I know that you're dealing with that as well as a student. Long-term stress causes the anterior pituitary to release a hormone called ACTH. ACTH travels in the bloodstream, goes down to the adrenal medulla, and causes it to release things like mineralocorticoids, aldosterone, glucocorticoids like cortisone and cortisol. And some of the impacts of these are, well, we know that aldosterone causes sodium and water retention in the kidneys. That will increase blood volume and blood pressure. And the glucocorticoids, what they will do is increase the blood glucose levels or blood sugar, and they also suppress the immune system. So this takes in a lot of information here, but I hope that that helps kind of simplify it a bit. Here is the amazing organ, the pancreas. I mentioned already it's a funny gland because it has endocrine function and exocrine function. Specifically, the islets of Langerhans are able to produce some hormones. And there are two different types of cells in the islets of Langerhans. Okay, so the islets of Langerhans are just spots in the pancreas, I should clarify. And these little spots have alpha and beta cells. The alpha and beta cells are kind of do antagonistic functions. They oppose each other, and we'll see that. The beta cells release insulin and the alpha cells release glucagon, and they do the exact opposite thing. Their goal is to maintain a steady blood sugar level. That's what we want in our blood. We want a steady amount of blood sugar. So it's up to your alpha and beta cells in your islets of Langerhans, which are in your pancreas, to release glucagon and insulin to control this. If you had 3 Tim Hortons donuts for breakfast, it's probably going to shoot your blood glucose levels up. That will cause a release of insulin, and insulin drives glucose into cells. It says here it increases the glucose uptake and metabolism by body cells. So just think of that as insulin driving or pushing glucose into all of your body cells. The impact of this is to drop the amount of glucose left in the blood, and that would be called hypoglycemic. So the impact is to lower blood glucose levels. Okay, so we already said that insulin and glucagon do opposite things, so we know that glucagon is going to oppose this. So let's say you haven't eaten anything for breakfast, and in fact you haven't eaten since supper time yesterday. Well, your blood glucose levels are going to dip a little bit. Your amount of sugar in your blood is going to dip, and glucagon will be released. Glucagon goes to the liver, and it causes the liver to release glucose to the blood, and this should increase your blood glucose levels. So perhaps now you can see how they balance each other out.
The sugary snack you devour enters your digestive system and is broken down to simple sugars like glucose. Glucose enters the bloodstream, causing an increase in blood glucose levels. But various mechanisms bring blood glucose back down to its normal level, the set point. This is an example of homeostasis, the body's tendency to maintain relatively constant internal conditions. Hormones produced by the pancreas regulate blood glucose levels. Let's zoom in. When blood glucose levels are high, glucose molecules leave the blood and enter beta cells in the pancreas. The beta cells respond by releasing the hormone insulin. Insulin enters the bloodstream and is transported to cells all over the body. Let's see what happens in the liver. Insulin binds to receptors on liver cells. This causes the cells to take in more glucose. Inside the liver cells, glucose is converted to glycogen, a storage molecule. Blood glucose levels decrease as glucose is taken up by liver cells and other body cells. As a result, less and less insulin is released by the pancreas, and blood glucose levels stabilize at their set point. This is an example of how negative feedback maintains homeostasis. What happens if you've skipped lunch and your blood glucose levels are low? Let's zoom into the pancreas again. When blood glucose levels are low, alpha cells in the pancreas release the hormone glucagon. Glucagon enters the bloodstream and acts on target cells in the liver. Glucagon binds to receptors on the liver cells, signaling the liver cells to break glycogen down to glucose. Glucose is released. and blood glucose levels increase. As a result, less glucagon is released by the pancreas, and blood glucose levels stabilize at their set point. In this way, two hormones with opposing effects allow the body to maintain homeostasis of blood glucose levels. In diabetes, the body is unable to maintain homeostasis of blood glucose levels. In type 1 diabetes, the beta cells of the pancreas are destroyed by the immune system, and so no insulin is produced. In type 2 diabetes, the pancreas produces insulin, but target cells do not take up glucose. In both types of diabetes, when blood glucose levels rise, cells do not take up the additional glucose, and so blood glucose remains high. This example shows the importance of homeostasis in everyone's life.
This is another excellent video. I encourage you to watch it a few times and take some really good notes. The animation is awesome for explaining about how our blood sugar is regulated. Here is an image as well that sort of ties in what happens with insulin and glucagon and how they oppose each other. Let's start in the middle left of the slide. It mentions here that our blood glucose levels are really high because perhaps we've eaten 4 jelly donuts. Exactly. I would probably have double chocolate, but anyway, let's say I ate 4 double chocolate donuts. My blood sugars would be really high in my blood. The pancreas would recognize this and release insulin. Remember, it's in the islets of Langerhans where this gets released. The insulin goes to the liver and makes the liver actually store some of the glucose into glycogen. So that's an additional note there. And also it drives glucose into tissue cells where it can get used. All of this should cause your blood sugar levels to drop and sort of reset them into a normal level. Now, what if we skip some meals and we haven't eaten much at all? Well, that's in the middle right-hand side. If our blood sugar gets too low, our pancreas can release glucagon. And glucagon goes to the liver and tells the liver to release some glucose. And that should solve the problem. Now, let's try to remember what we all learned in sex ed class in middle school about the ovaries and testes. So the ovaries are in women. They're located in the pelvic cavity. And I think we all know that they produce eggs. But they also produce a couple of hormones known as estrogen and progesterone. We're going to look at what those do in a moment. I think we also know that the testes are suspended in the scrotum outside the pelvic cavity in males, and that they produce hormones, and they do, the hormone testosterone, and they produce sperm. Estrogen has many roles. Some of them are listed here, like breast development, maturing the female reproductive system, and regulating the menstrual cycle. And progesterone has a role with the menstrual cycle as well, and ensuring the implantation of an embryo in the uterus and getting the breast ready for lactation. Produce testosterone and other androgens. Testosterone is responsible for a lot of the male characteristics that we think of, and maturation of the male reproductive system, and sperm cell production. In this lecture, we've hit on some of the functions of the endocrine system, but I really want to be humble and say that there's a lot more complexity than what we've hit on here. For example, here are a few other organs that tend to secrete hormones. They're listed here. And there's a lot that we're still learning about hormones and the endocrine system. So stay tuned. We might learn more in our careers about the endocrine system.